All right. Hello, hello. Welcome. My name's Tom Smith with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And today I am very, very happy to present an extremely special guest to not only me and those of us who run the society, but to all the members across the country and around the world. I'm speaking of none other than Mr. Pip Hills, member number 001, the gentleman who started all of this back in 1983, and not just the society as the best club on earth for single cask whiskey, but really igniting the passion for single cask whiskeys within Scotland and the industry there. So certainly very far reaching, well beyond the boundaries of the vaults. But starting last week and going through this week in the US, over in the UK, we started celebrating the Gathering, which it really kind of tips a cap to the vaults in Leith and invites members from around the globe to in more normal times actually make the journey to the vaults and enjoy some wonderful tastings. Of course, this year it's a bit more not so in person, a bit more virtual, but we're certainly doing the best we can. And so there are several other tastings that you can log into, both with Scotch Malt Whisky Society in America and also in the UK. And speaking of which, tomorrow at 12 p.m., my colleagues, I believe Jenna and possibly Ben, will be tasting through the September Outturn, the Global Gathering, and they'll be going through several selections there, and of course, revealing the remainder of the whiskeys that they don't taste. As part of this global gathering, we are offering a really, I think, special little add-on to your orders tomorrow. For anyone who purchases 3 or more bottles, they are going to get a lovely little book called The Founder's Tale by Mr. Pip Hills. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to get chatting with Pip, and we're going to talk about a lot of the stories in here. But just to reiterate, if you make a purchase of 3 bottles minimum, you will have a book shipped to you. It's a wonderful read with a dram. If you already have a book, perhaps you know somebody in your life who would enjoy something like this. You're going to find out very shortly that Pip is a master storyteller. And Ben and I both witnessed this over in Scotland in May of 2019. We met Pip and had a lovely dinner with him, and he regaled us with tales of his various adventures around the world, all related, of course, to the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. So I think without further ado, we are going to bring the man, the myth, the legend in here, Mr. Pip Hills. Welcome, sir.
Hello, nice to be here.
It's great. It's so great to have you, and it's wonderful to see you again. You're looking very well. I hope you have a glass of malt in front of you.
Yes, I do.
Very good. Slanja, thanks so much for joining us. For all of those of you at home, this would be a great time to pick up a glass of whiskey. I know it may be 9 o'clock in the morning in some places, but I think that's just fine today. So cheers. I hope everyone had a lovely Labor Day weekend. And Pip, I think we should just hop right into it here. I have a few questions for you. A lot of this drawing from the content of the book, but I think the first question that a lot of us are really interested in is being, fairly in tune with the Scotch malt whiskey industry in the 2020. What was it like in Scotland, specifically in Edinburgh, in the 1970s, leading up to basically your founding of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society? In the US, Scotch whiskey was, essentially a non-issue. We really weren't, it wasn't in our culture yet. So what were you looking at when you went to the pub? What sort of things did you see behind the bar?
If you went into a pub in Edinburgh, you would see mainly blended whiskey. I mean, generally speaking, when people drank whiskey, they drank blend. And the traditional drink in Scotland was a blended whiskey with some lemonade. That's what that's how most Scots drank their whiskey. In the few bars where there were malt stock, you might see half a dozen, but you would rarely see more than that. And the malts were almost unknown. They were little known in Scotland, and they were almost completely unknown outside Scotland, as little as time ago as that. It seems extraordinary now, given the extent of the change, but it was very much a minority interest. It had some. There were one or two places which still maintained ancient traditions, but very, very few. And Maggie's telling me I should speak up.
That would be fine.
Right. The notion of whiskey being something which you could inspect and understand and taste and talk about was completely foreign. Nobody had anything of the sort. Whiskey was something that came in a bottle with a brand name on it. And the whiskey industry was something everybody knew it was there, but certainly nobody I knew anything much about whiskey. And or certainly knew anything much about the whiskey industry. It kept itself very much to itself. And in a sense, I was able to think about starting the society and about buying casks of whiskey, because there was no tradition of this sort at all. And sorry, I'm wavering a bit here, but
not at all.
The industry was something completely separate from the public. It kept itself very much to itself, and very few people would, unless you were part of the magic circle of the industry itself, would know anything about it. And it didn't encourage people to know anything about it. It sold its whiskies by reference to a brand. Think of any of the great brands; those were the names that people ordered the whiskey by. If you considered yourself a connoisseur and you went into a bar, you would order a Dewar's or a Grouse or something of the sort. If you were an ordinary country, you just ordered a whiskey. The general quality of whiskey, that's to say blended whiskey, was pretty poor, has to be said. The industry had been on a roll for well over 100 years, and people trusted the brand names. And they were certainly well worthy of their trust. The blenders turned out branded whiskies which were as uniform as possible, and they wanted it. Their main desideratum was that a customer buying whiskey in a bar, it should taste the same today as it did yesterday. And the skill of a blender was mainly aimed at getting uniformity of flavor. Given uniformity of flavor, you could then publicize the brand in the certainty that if somebody drank the stuff and liked it, they would then order by that brand name again. And that was all very fine, but it militated against any understanding of what was going on. It was assumed that blending was an arcane and opaque skill, that blenders did something that ordinary human beings couldn't do. They produced this extraordinary stuff. And nobody ever talked about what was going on in the process of blending. There were practically no books about whiskey. You can count on the fingers of one hand, I would say, by the late 60s, you could count on your fingers the number of books which there were relating to whiskey. And there were, in fact, only two of any importance, because people writing books about whiskey in those days tended to say the things that the whiskey blenders would want them to say, which meant, of course, that they talked mainly about blends and they didn't mention single malt very much. They certainly never mentioned the individuality of single malt. And the idea of describing the flavor was just alien to them. I mean, the whiskey tasted like whiskey. That was all it was. One of the things we introduced with the society, which astonishingly now was thought revolutionary then, was to think about the flavor and analyze it by comparison with other things. Now, that's commonplace now, but was a bizarre idea then.
Yeah.
I guess when we started the society, it was the coming together of a whole lot of things. It was the coming together of the individuality of the cask, sure, of the quality of the whiskey, but it was also the idea, the revolutionary idea, that it might be possible to taste this stuff and speak about and put words to the flavors that you could discern in it.
So that's sort of the backdrop of what you were dealing with and what many Scots were dealing with as sort of a drinking culture at that point. But the society casks didn't just magically appear at the vaults. There's a wonderful story behind all of this and the series of events that essentially led up to you driving your Lagonda up to the Speyside. Could you spend a little while telling us about this?
Yeah, well, it was just a chapter of accident. I should explain that I never managed in my life of anything recognizable as a career. I tended to do whatever seemed like a good idea at the time, which is not the sort of thing that people do who are carving careers. And I would have schemes. And I would get a bee in my bonnet about something, and I would go off and do something about it. And sometimes there were very little schemes, and sometimes they were really quite large ones. I tried to take over Scottish television at one point and raised £7.5 million to buy it with, which, I mean, it doesn't seem like very much now, but it was a lot of money back in the 1970s. And the starting with Whisky Society was just basically a good idea and saying, why don't we do something? So the origins of it were purely accidental. I have these two old and very dear friends they still have the little farm in Aberdeenshire that I described in the book. And their next door neighbour was called Stan, and he was a wealthy farmer. And his wealth didn't show in anything that you could see. He was not a man who wore smart suits. I should think Stan probably had one suit. I'd be very surprised if he had more than one. But he did have a luxury, and that was once a year when he got into his old Land Rover and drove it over to Speyside and up the valley to Glenfarclas, and from the grant at Glenfarclas he bought a single cask of Glenfarclas. It was a sherry quarter. Glenfarclas had long been in the habit of maturing, of buying quarter casks, I think 11 gallons, something like that, yeah. And bringing them from Jerez and filling them with whiskey. And these casks they sold to customers. I mean, it wasn't like a customer in a shop. You had to inherit a supply of casks, and they would sell you one a year. I think it was a very ancient custom that went back to the days when we're talking about 200 years ago here, to the days when glass bottles were fairly rare and rather expensive. And if you wanted to buy whiskey, you bought it by the jug from somebody who bought it in a cask, or if you were wealthy enough, you bought a cask yourself. Anyway, when I went to visit the Macardos, Stan would come over for an evening of dispute. mostly politics, not necessarily mainline party politics, but sexual politics. He was quite strong on these. He had very strong views as to the place of women and things of that sort. And Stan, I had two daughters by the time, and tended, having got two daughters, tended to be rather keen on daughters than perhaps I would have been otherwise. And we would talk about things, and we would disagree about quite a lot of the things. But the point about Stan was that when he came to visit, he would bring with him a lemonade bottle full of whiskey. And this was whiskey which he had drawn from his cask and Glenfarclas. And I thought I had never tasted whiskey like it. It was quite unlike not just any of the blends that I was used to, but quite unlike any of the single malts that by that time I'd drunk. And I thought it was wonderful. And we would drink quite a lot of it. And the next morning, despite the fact that we had been rather drunk, I wouldn't feel like death. Now, I have all my life suffered severely from hangovers. And really, a hangover is not a place I want to go to ever. It's just ghastly. And amazingly, I could get drunk on this stuff and not have a hellish hangover. And after this, and Stan would go off and he'd leave some of the remains behind. And this happened quite regularly. And gradually I got interested in why this whiskey was so unlike what I thought of whiskey. And so I made a few inquiries. And it turned out that the reason this whiskey was so good was, firstly, we were getting it straight from the cask, and secondly, the cask we were getting it from was a very, very fine container for whiskey. The point about the sherry quarters is that the smaller the cask, the greater the area of wood in contact with the whiskey.
Right, so more pronounced.
The more rapid the maturation. So a 10-year-old in a sherry quarter is maybe the equivalent of about 15 otherwise in a Hogger or butt. Pardon me. But really, I don't remember when it was, but at some point I had a good idea, and that was that perhaps my friends would like to join me, and we could persuade Glenfarclas to let us have a cask of this whiskey. And out of this idea was born a syndicate. And I think there were 10 or 11 of us at the start. And I got together a group of my pals and said, look guys, here is this amazing whiskey, and it ought to be possible to buy some of it. If I were to arrange it, would you be interested? They all said, of course, without a doubt. So I phoned up Glenfarclas, explained who I was. They wouldn't sell to just anyone. You had to be known to them. I mean, this stuff wasn't available to the general public, but I had the great advantage of knowing Stan. And since Stan was a very old customer of Grant's, they thought that perhaps the chances are I was an okay person. And it also seemed that round about that time, one of their customers had died. That's to say, a customer who took a cask of Glenfarclas each year. And no one was left to inherit his supply. Now, being Glenfarclas, they had no trouble in getting rid of whiskey, but whatever happened, they decided that I would probably be a suitable person and that I wouldn't mess about with that whiskey. And they agreed to sell it to me. So I went back to the members of my syndicate. They all said, fine, that's fine, you get the whiskey, we'll bring the cash. And out of that was born a syndicate to buy casks of Glenfarclas.
All right.
And then after there's a lot of stories round about that, which you'll find in the book,
Sure.
and including one of the syndicate members who inconsiderately died before he could get his whiskey, and that turned out not too badly either, because we had a grand wake using his gallon of whiskey. But
Hell of a way to go.
Yeah, well, I got it was late in the year, and then there was Christmas, and then it was early February before the weather looked suitable for me going up to Glenfarclas, and I phoned the Grants, and I got a check guaranteed. In those days, you would have the bank certify that the check was good, and off I went in my car, which I've described in the book, my ancient Lagonda, and I drove up over the Grampians and went to Glenfarclas, where I handed over my check, and they were rather surprised by the Lagonda. Well, they didn't have a lot of customers who turned up in cars like that, but the boot, what in America you would call the trunk of the Lagonda, folded down so to provide a flat platform, and this was so that you could belt a trunk on it, and it had clips where you could fasten your trunk, and that was very suitable. I brought some wedges, and we wedged the quarter cask Glenfarclas on it, and I drove back down, and we had a meeting of the syndicate, and the syndicate all tasted the whiskey, and they all thought the whiskey was wonderful, and they tasted it again and thought it was even better. And I had produced gallon jars, and each of us had a gallon of whiskey as our syndicate share. And that was how it started. It was very simple. There was nothing fancy about it. None of us considered ourselves connoisseurs of whiskey. We were just a bunch of guys who, one of us having had a good idea, decided to pursue it.
So there were stories of your syndicate meeting at your flat for several times, and then it got to the point where perhaps maybe they brought too many of their own friends, and it got a little too loud, and perhaps you were strongly encouraged maybe to take your party elsewhere. Is there any truth to this?
Well, it's like all these things. Truth is mainly in people's recollection, and I've tried to make mine as accurate as I could. That's
Sure.
One of the reasons I wrote the book, by the way, and because so many myths and legends had grown up around this thing, that I thought, maybe while I was still kicking, to use an American expression, that I ought to put it down in print as I recollected it. And the story about the syndicate is pretty straightforward. What happened was, all of these people, my syndicate members, were all convivial people. They liked drinking drams, and they liked drinking drams with their friends. They weren't the sort of people who squirreled a good bottle away and only drank it by themselves. And they would give drams of the Glenfarclas to their friends, and the friends would all say, "This is amazing whiskey. Where did you get it?" And they would then tell the friends about Pip's syndicate, and the friends of the friends would say, "Is this syndicate closed? Can we join?" And the friend would say, "Well, I don't know. It's Pip that runs it. Why don't you ring him?" So they would give people my phone number, and within a few weeks of the syndicate starting, I started getting telephone calls, and sometimes the calls would be from people I knew, and they would say, "Hey, I've just had some of your syndicate whiskey, and it's great. Why wasn't I invited to join?" And that's a bit difficult, I'm just saying, because I didn't think about it. But and they would say, well, the least you can do is put me on the list, and if you do it again, make sure that I'm part of it. That was what happened sometimes. Other times, what the person calling I would answer the phone, and the person would say, "Excuse me, you don't know me. My name is such and such. I'm a friend of so-and-so who's a member of your whiskey syndicate. And I've just tasted some of that amazing malt whiskey. Is there any chance I could join your syndicate?" And I said, well, I never had any thoughts of doing anything else or ever doing it again. But I tell you what, give me your phone number. And no promises, if I do it again, then I'll let you know. So I had a notebook in which I had lots and lots of names and telephone numbers. And eventually I called a meeting of the syndicate. And the syndicate members were all quite pleased. This was a month or two after the first time. And generally speaking, syndicate members didn't ask why I wanted them to come to a meeting, because they all wanted a meeting, because quite a few of them were saying, well, the whiskey is great, but it's going down very quickly. When are we going to get some more?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I have no intention of getting any more whiskey. And besides, I said, I've got these friends of yours who've all given me their phone numbers and want to join the syndicate. So the syndicate members said, oh, that's easy, that's fine. We'll just double the number of the syndicate. And I said, hold on. I never said anything about doing it again. As far as I was concerned, this was just a one-off. Oh, no, not at all. They said, you'll need to do it again, because we're soon going to run out of whiskey. Our friends keep coming around and bringing their friends with them, and they all want to be given drams, and it's going down very quickly. And when are we going to do it again? And then there were all the new guys who wanted to join. So the syndicate decided that we would double the size of the syndicate, and that I would go to Glenfarclas or wherever and get another cask of whiskey, only twice as big. And I thought, well, it doesn't seem any reason why we shouldn't. I have to say that by that time, because the word of the syndicate was spreading, and I kept having visitors, and I had to give visitors drams out of my gallon of whiskey, that my store of whiskey was going down as well. So I said, no promises here, but what I will do is I will go back to Glenfarclas and I'll say, is there any chance that we could get either two of these sherry quarters or something to top? And the syndicate all said, that's fine. And they all went off into the night, having drunk quite a lot of my whiskey. And I was left thinking, well, how am I going to manage this? However, I rang Glenfarclas and I explained the situation. And the people at Glenfarclas were very nice about it. And they said, well, we can let you have another 2 quarters. And they'll both be 9 years old. But we won't let you have any more, because beyond 9 years, it's frankly too young. So I said, okay. So the syndicate doubled in numbers. And I went to Glenfarclas with a trailer this time, and I brought back 2 casks of whiskey. And that's really how the thing started. And even at that time, I hadn't had any thought of doing anything beyond it.
So eventually, you make your way to the vaults, and there's a term, I think you call it zeitgeist, that you kind of experienced in this. And some might wonder, why didn't you set up shop at the Royal Mile perhaps versus Leith? Can you comment on how this syndicate ended up sort of taking up residence at the vaults?
Well, the syndicate kept growing, and people kept phoning me, and I was getting a larger and larger list of numbers of people who wanted some of this whiskey. And it was around about that time, I guess, that I thought to myself, this whiskey really is better than the whiskey we've been used to. It tastes nicer. It doesn't give you hangovers. There is clearly a supply of this stuff, and there is a market for it. And the market and the supply are miles apart. I mean, if there were whiskey as good as this in a proprietary bottle, sorry, that's Maggie's one of the platform. It's if the thing. Sorry, I've kind of lost the thread there. I'll go back. The idea occurred to me that perhaps there was a market here which wasn't being served by traditional whiskey. Obviously there was a market that wasn't being supplied, and I thought, well, why don't we think about supplying it? And so I called another meeting of the syndicate, and the syndicate were all pleased, and they all said, "Are we going to have more whiskey?" And I said, "Well, no. What I was thinking was that if this stuff is as good as we think it is, and all our friends think it is, we'd be nuts not to try and sell it. There's something strange in the whiskey industry that they're not selling whiskey as good as this. And it's not just us. It's not just the dozen or people who started the syndicate, but it's all of you guys. And I mean, these are all guys who've been around. They knew what they were doing, and they were a bright bunch of people. And they all said, look, this whiskey is a lot better than stuff we're getting in the pubs and the off licenses. So I volunteered to do some research, and depending on the research, basically it would be a feasibility study, except it wouldn't be written down. And I would see if I could get some facts. So I was fortunate. I describe in the book a friend of mine called John Ferguson. Now, I won't start telling you stories about Ferguson because he was a bad lot. He was disgraced, and anyway, he's dead. But he was a terrific guy, and he was a great pal of mine for many years, and we had some very good times together. And John was a member of my original syndicate. And I said to John, I said, look, I need to find out about this. What's going on here? Do you know anyone who knows about whiskey? And John said, sure, Russell Sharp knows about whiskey. I said, Russell, come across him. How do I know Russell? He said, he's a mountaineer. I know the man you mean, I said. So I said, do you have his contact? John said, I'll get it. Why don't we have a meeting? And you can put it to Russell. So now I should explain perhaps about this. When I was young, I was very foolish, and I spent a lot of my time climbing mountains. And there was a kind of fraternity of mountaineers in which there was a certain amount of trust and good fellowship. And there were also a lot of scoundrels as well, including some of my best friends. But I guess the point about being a mountaineer is if there's you and another guy and a rope between you, and your life or death depends on the rope and the other guy, you've got to trust him. And so there's a kind of camaraderie among mountaineers. And really, John, I said to John, can you get in touch with Russell and we'll talk to Russell? And John said, yeah, fine. So a meeting was arranged in the Horseshoe Bar in Glasgow. This is a very ancient bar in a little side street in Glasgow. It's still there and it's still much the same. I think I said in the book that it sold good beer and bad pies. I'm sure the pies are much better than they were then. But anyway, one lunchtime in Glasgow, John and Russell and I convened. Now, what I didn't know was that Russell was actually a big shot in the whiskey industry. He was a brewer by training, and the brewer is the important man in the distillery. The distiller just does the fancy stuff. The brewer is the man who makes the ale out of which the good whiskey is distilled. And Russell at the time was the head chemist of the Shivers Group, who owned an American company, owned a whole raft of distilleries. And he was a technical expert on whiskey. And we had this meeting, and I said to Russell, what's all this about? Why is this whiskey we're tasting so good? And Russell said, well, he said, it's down to two things. He said, firstly, it's down to the fact that you're getting it at full strength and it hasn't been chill filtered. And he explained about chill filtration. And he said, secondly, it's about the fact that whiskey in the cask varies enormously in quality, depending on the quality of the cask it's been matured in. And what you've been lucky in getting was whiskey in first-class condition out of really first-class casks. And he said the combination of the two is, sure, it's amazing, it's wonderful stuff. And I said, the natural question is, why don't the distillers sell this stuff? And he said, I thought you'd know about that by now. What the distillers want to sell is blended whiskey. Their profit margins on blended whiskey are colossal. They don't want to sell malts. There's a few of them do, just to show face. But really, what they want to do is to sell blends. Is that a bee we've got? There's something buzzing about. Yeah. So the upshot of this was that I explained to Russell that I had the idea of bottling this stuff and making it available more widely than the Syndicate. And Russell said, well, he said, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And he said, look, you are very small. The whiskey industry is very old and very big and very rich, and they have lots and lots and lots of lawyers on their books. And these lawyers are very smart guys, and they've got the whole thing sewn up. And if you go out and start to try and sell their whiskey, they'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. And you will find a lawsuit that you can't afford to resist, and you'll be forced to pack up. But he said, thinking about it, he said, it's an interesting idea. He said, if you decide to do it, keep me in the loop, because I'd be interested. So I left the meeting in some ways discouraged, but what I had was one of the whiskey industry's leading technical experts on site, and that was important. And so I called the Syndicate meeting, said, right guys, this is the plan. We're going to establish, I found out why this whiskey is so good. Nobody is producing it, lots of people would drink it, and we're going to try and do it. And what do you think? And not all of them. There were a few syndicate members who didn't like the idea of making the thing public. But I said, look, this is Scotland's finest product and it's not being sold. I mean, let it appeal to your patriotism, if nothing else.
Right.
And we owe it to the world to make this stuff available. So the vast majority of the members of the syndicate said, okay, if you can figure out a way to do it, then we'll all pitch in. Now, you will notice there's a certain imbalance in all of this. There's all the guys in the syndicate on the one side saying, yes, go ahead, we'll be encouraging, and there's me on the other side going to have to figure out how to do it.
Right.
However, that didn't occur to me at the time. And I said, yeah, that's fine, let's do it. But we'll need to decide on a name, because we're going to need a limited company. It's got to be a name that sounds good, that sounds real, that sounds kind of classy. And because the registrar of companies is very particular about company names. He won't let you have any old nonsense as a company name, especially something that pretends to have some national significance. Oh no, they said, what shall we call it? And I said, well, why don't we call it the Scotch Malt Whisky Society? Oh, they said, that sounds just fine. So we decided that we would call ourselves the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. So they all went home and I was left with putting the thing together. And I got on to my lawyer. I explained what it was about, said to the lawyer, would you apply to the registrar? And the lawyer said, sure, I'll apply. But he said, I should warn you that the register, it sounds like an important sort of organization, Scotch Malt Whisky Society. You have a job convincing him. So I said, well, try it anyway. So the lawyer put in an application on our behalf, and I got a call, curiously not from the lawyer, but from the registrar of companies. And the registrar said, well, it's about this company you want to register called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Can you give us a good reason why we should let you have such a pretentious title? And I said, as far as I'm aware, we are a Scotch Malt Whisky Society. We're a society of folk who've come together to buy and drink Scotch Malt Whisky. And I said, as far as I know, there isn't another one. We're the only one. Oh, he said, that sounds fair enough. And so he gave us the title. So we duly registered a company called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society Limited. And that's how it came about. The vaults is kind of the next chapter, really. Does that take you to where you wanted us to be?
Indeed, which is on the steps of the vaults. So now you have the idea. You have Russell in your back pocket, essentially, rooting you on, even though there are obstacles and such. And now it seems like you just need a really nice place to put this whole thing.
Well, yes, there was that. Because, I mean, it was our intention right from the beginning, or I should say, rather, it was my intention, that this should be what Americans would call a classy sort of organization. I mean, the sense of the word class in the United States is different from what it is in Britain, and the adjective classy goes along with it. So it was. I didn't want it to be a kind of posh person's drinking club. That was always quite clear. I wanted it to be available to anyone who would cough up the cash to join and would buy the whiskey. And this was a motivating force on my part right from the beginning. I'm not saying it was a motivation for everyone involved, alas, but that's another story. Anyway, I thought if we are going to set up this company, we're going to need a place to do it. And central Edinburgh, where I lived by that time, was out of the question. The rising, I had bought an apartment in what's called the new town of Edinburgh. It's a very, very old new town. They're 250 years old and counting. But by the time we started the society, the rise in property values had caught up, and property in the centre of Edinburgh was prohibitively expensive. But just down the road from Edinburgh is Leith. And Leith at the time was very run down and very dirty, and all the buildings were black from the soot of centuries. And it was it was not a place where, by and large, respectable people went. And what it did have was some very fine buildings, and quite a lot of them were disused, or not very much used. And I liked Leith a lot. Yeah. And so when I cast my eyes around for a locality in which to lodge the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, Leith was where I looked. And there was one building in Leith that stood out among them all, and it was called the Vaults. The Vaults, as I think I said in that piece, that there was something about it, and I'd known about it for years, and it had a high wall round it, and there were trucks went in and out from time to time, laden with casks, and I didn't know what went on, but it looked interesting, and I thought, well, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I walked in one day in my usual gear, which was not smart, and I walked up the stair, because at the time there was a little notice saying office pointing up the stair, and I walked up the stair, and there's rather a smart receptionist behind a desk, and I explained to the receptionist what I was there for, and she said, "Oh, well," she said, "I think perhaps you ought to speak to one of our directors." She said, "I'll ask Mr. Walters to come and see you." And she called, a man came out called John Walter or Walters, and he was a very nice man, and he was a very traditional businessman. That's to say, he wore a three-piece suit, and he even had a watch chain across his waistcoat. Oh. And he was clearly out of a different generation. Remember, at that time, I was a generation that had grown up in the 60s, and the generational divide was enormous at that time. But I explained what I was about. I explained that I needed a building, that I thought his building was a wonderful building, and was there any chance of buying it? This, I should say, came from a man who at the time had no money at all, or enough to buy the odd cask of whiskey, but that was about it. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, he said, the firm has been in this building for about 300 years, and in a month's time, we're moving to more convenient modern premises. And you could tell from his voice that he didn't think that was a good idea at all. But he said, there are a lot of old buildings in Leith, and there aren't a lot of people buying them. So I think if you made any reasonable offer, the directors would probably He didn't actually say bite your hand off, but you could tell that was what he wanted to say. And so I got together some members of the syndicate, 5 of us, and we're by hook or by crook raised £50,000 and made J.G. Thomson and Company an offer, and they sold us the building. And as so often in my career, it was a financial disaster, but that's another story. But we bought the building, and it was wonderful.
Well, that was in 1983 that you officially started the Scotch Malt Whisky Society.
Yes, yes.
Very good.
Yeah.
And to this day, I mean, I guess not today and maybe not tomorrow, but historically, up until about March or so, any member could go there and sit in a beautiful, comfortable couch in front of a fireplace and enjoy a nice dram. And I'm certain we'll get back there very, very soon. It's remarkable to me the amount of timing and luck that seems to have played in to this now 30,000 member global organization when it first started. And it also sounds very much like you were not without your obstacles and your challenges, where you could have just packed it up and moved on to another good idea. So I think on behalf of many members, thank you for seeing this out and seeing this through. It's a remarkable community that's been created, I think, and it's all thanks to you, sir.
It's a great pleasure to me.
It's what? I'm sorry?
It's a great pleasure to me.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly one of many legacies, I'm sure, that you are leaving. But yeah. So I want to transition maybe. This is the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in America, and while you started the society in the UK in 1983, it wasn't until 9 years later that the society came to the United States, still very much in its infancy of Scotch malt whiskey appreciation. I think there was a bit more help throughout the 80s, but still, can you talk about how you came to meet Alan Shane and founded the society in the U.S. with him?
Yeah. Well, it had been obvious from early on that there was a vast potential market in the United States. We had established the society in Britain, and people kept coming in and asking, saying, when people would come from America and they would discover us, and they would come in and they'd have a drink in the box and they'd say, "This is wonderful. When are you going to bring it to America?" And lots of people, we had lots and lots of American members long before we actually made the transition. And it was very obvious to us that there had to be a huge market for the society in America, simply because Americans, seen from the outside, are most convivial people.
Why, thank you, sir.
Well, I mean, we all of us have a different view of our own people from what people outside have. But every time I have gone to America, I've always had a great time, and I've always had really good experiences with Americans, and all sorts of Americans. I mean, irrespective of ethnicity or political complexion, they've all been really nice people. Indeed, to such an extent that I sometimes say to myself, how can it be that such nice people believe such appalling things? But that's true.
Well, that is a topic for another live stream, I think.
But I'm sure they think the same about me. But the point is, the whole point of the society was that it was bringing people together, irrespective of what seemed to be absolutely fundamental disagreements. And that I think is is a very noticeable aspect of it. Anyway, it was clear that we should go to America and that we should try our hand there. And at that time, there were lots of government departments who specialized in helping people to export, to open new export trades. And there were a number of them were very interested in it and spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to help us to go to the United States. And I must say, most of it was time wasted, because what we really needed was one guy who knew the liquor business in the US. That was the essence of it. And we had the great good fortune to be discovered by Alan Shane. It was more Alan discovering us than us discovering Alan. And I liked Alan the moment I met him. I thought, this is a brilliant guy. And he was an enthusiast, and he was just an extraordinary character. And he was already in the liquor business. And he said, why don't we set up the Whisky Society in the US? And it was mainly through Alan's instrumentality that we were able to take the thing to the US. And it was he who saw us. I mean, I don't have to tell you what an absolute minefield it is trying to introduce liquor to the US.
Absolutely.
That excellent organization, the Food and Drugs Administration, I used to deal with them as an accountant, and I always found them most obliging. But they do have very set rules, and you have to obey the rules.
They have very set rules, not quite as stringent as the TTB, which is another governmental agency with extremely strict rules, which we're constantly navigating.
Well, one of the things that I found very curious about the United States was that if you wanted to bring first-class Scotch whisky into America, you had to jump through all sorts of hoops and go to all sorts of absurd lengths in order to do it. Whereas if you wanted to bring good quality heroin in, there was no trouble at all. You just found yourself a mafioso or a Cuban or somebody, and they would bring it in for you.
Yes.
Since we were always terribly, occasionally people would ask me what it was I was coming to the United States for, and I would say, well, basically I'm in the drug trade. And they would all bristle and say, how appalling, what sort of drug are you selling? And I would say, whiskey. And they would immediately change their tack and say, oh, whiskey, well, that's all right. They know what whiskey is about. It was always a pleasure to go through immigration.
I was going to say,
going into the US in immigration, you were in the aliens file, and you would hand your passport over, and the guy behind the counter would say, how long are you coming here for? What are you coming here for? You want to do business?
Right.
What's your business? And I would say, whiskey. Whereupon he would smile, oh, he would say, and stamp the passport.
It's very funny when I fly to Glasgow or Edinburgh, I get the same reaction actually from your customs folks, and I can only imagine that someone like you, with your charm and wit, could get away with saying heroin to a customs agent and recover from that without being put into a room for at least 48 hours.
I don't think I ever said it to a customs agent.
Well, that's probably good. That's probably good.
I wasn't that daft.
Oh goodness. So Alan, I've known Alan for years. He's been an incredible mentor to me, and in fact, my first day on the job was flying to Florida to meet with the Shane family and be given a very substantial orientation to the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And Alan told me a story. I'm not sure if you can expand on this, but how he did in fact seek out the society, and you and him shared a boat trip around the Hebrides. He said by the end of it that he was certain that the Scotch Malt Whisky Society was the perfect thing for him to launch in the U.S. Are there any details about this boat trip that you can share, or that you actually remember?
Yes. I can't remember if I wrote about it in the book, but
I think you wrote about that trip, but probably
it was arranged. It was arranged that Alan, as part of us coming together, that Alan would pay us a visit in Scotland. He would pay us a visit at the vaults, and then he had said he liked boats, and that was great by me, because I've a long-standing lifetime relationship with boats.
Yeah.
There's a pause there.
That's okay. If you don't want to go further with that,
Maggie's sitting beside me, and it was inevitable there would be a pause where I think guiltily about how much about time and money I spent on books. But I said to her, we agreed that I would take Alan to some Islay distilleries by boat, and that was fine. So Alan would fly in, and we would go to the vaults. We'd go to one or two mainland distilleries, and then we would go by boat to Islay. And at the time, I had a couple of friends who ran boats out of a little town called Troon down in Ayrshire. And I got Neil's dad, who had a very nice motor yacht, and who agreed to take us. So the trip was organized, and it was arranged. Alan wanted to visit Campbelltown Distillery. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Campbelltown.
But I have, yes.
Yeah, well, you will know how long a journey it is by road.
It took us about four and a half hours from Edinburgh. It was a beautiful drive.
If you're lucky.
Yeah.
But it's all that long drive down the Mull of Kintyre on single track roads.
Yeah.
I decided to bypass this by getting a boat, which would take us to Campbelltown, and which would then, weather permitting, take us down round the Mull of Kintyre and up to Islay. And my pal Neil's dad would take us, and it was a nice boat, big roomy boat, and very seaworthy. And I knew the people well. And I took Alan down to Troon, and we boarded the boat, and we went to Campbelltown, and it was great. And we went to Springbank, and Springbank showed us round and gave us dinner, and everything was fine. But we were watching the weather, because the Mull of Kintyre is not a place to be in a small boat if the weather's not perfect. There is a very strong southerly tide race running off the Mull, and if a southwesterly breeze hits that, then you get very steep seas. And I figured at that time that possibly this was not the kind of boating that Alan was going to want. And over dinner, the lads were keeping an eye on the weather forecast. And after dinner, we finished dinner about 10 o'clock at night, and we had a conference. And there was a southwesterly gale blowing up, and we were looking at the times of the tide. And I said to Alan, Alan, look, I got bad news for you. I don't think we should try to make the passage of the Mull. You would not like it. It's not a nice place to be in a southwesterly gale and an ebb tide. Alan said, well, you know, I'd be guided by you. I said, what we'll do tonight is we'll run up to Tarbert, which is further up Loch Fyne, and we get a taxi across Tarbert. Tarbert in Gaelic means a very narrow strip of land, and there is at that point the mainland is only about 5 miles wide, and we'll drive across and we'll catch the steamer. So that was fine, that we would spend the night on the boat, and what we would do is we would run up Loch Tarbert. And these are, when I say lochs, these are sea lochs. They're long inlets of the sea. And it was decided that we would spend the night at Tarbert. So about 10 o'clock, we were going to go out and we were going to make the passage up the loch. 2 or 3 hours. And Tarbert Harbour, you probably don't recollect it, but it's a very enclosed harbour, and it has very bright lights at night. And we're in the wheelhouse of this yacht, and we're just about to leave the harbour, and behind us everything is brightly lit and perfectly calm. And just beyond the lighthouse is black. And I mean, I don't mean any sort of black. It's inky black. There is no light at all except what's behind us. Now, most people who live in cities don't ever experience this. The loch at that point is maybe 20 or 30 miles wide. So the only lights would be house lamps. At 30 miles, they don't give you a lot of light. And I remember Alan saying to me, I realized later that he was saying it slightly nervously. He said, Pip, he said, do you do a lot of sailing at night? And I thought nothing of it. I said, yes, Alan, and to tell the truth, one of my favorite occupations is night sailing. I said, you get yourself on the tiller or the wheel, and you find yourself a suitable star, and you line it up with a bit of the rigging, and you don't really need to watch the compass too much, and use a star to sail her by. And I said, it's just lovely, I like it. And I said, besides, the loch is completely clear, there are no off-lying dangers at all. And off we go, and Neil's dad will steer her, and we'll go to our beds. We drank a glass of whiskey, and Alan seemed to be slightly, he seemed to be reassured to a certain extent. He certainly went off to his bunk like a good chap. And it was only years later that it turned out that Alan's idea of sailing was a boat with an outboard on Long Island Sound and a 6-pack and a fishing rod.
Sure, there you go.
This was a bit out of his experience. It all went perfectly well. We got a taxi across and we got the early morning boat. And as it turned out, it was just as well we did, because by morning it was blowing a hurry and she couldn't put into Port Asking, and she had to go elsewhere. So it was the right decision.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And that's actually detail that Alan never shared with me. He said he woke up the next day a little green, maybe, and he said, yes, this is it. This is.
No, it wasn't green. There wasn't a ripple on the surface on the road.
Okay. Well, from that point onward, there were. It sounds
might well have been green later in the day, because
maybe that was it. Maybe that was it. Yeah.
Steamer trip was pretty damned rough.
Yeah.
I think we eventually went to Port Ellen. It's either Port Ellen or Port Asking, probably Port Asking, because it's more sheltered in the southwesterly.
Right. Yeah. So that essentially started the society in the United States. Now, we're at about an hour and 10 minutes into this. I want to make sure you're okay on time for now.
Yeah, I'm okay at the moment. Getting slightly
all right,
more.
good.
I'll have a dram.
Yeah, please enjoy. Have that one on me for sure. So there were certain. It seems there were certain opportunities to spread the word in the United States. One of them, I'll just touch on briefly, would be with the Forbes family, and certainly a tour of Fabergé eggs that should not be missed in the book. But the one that I would like to maybe ask you to go into more detail on is found in chapter 20, called American Papers, and this is when one Paul Levy, I believe, finds you and says, "I'm interested in what's going on with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society." This is now a few years on now, maybe 10 years or so after the inception of the society. And this younger gentleman from the Wall Street Journal is now interested in what the society is all about. Do you would you mind sharing a little bit of this story and how?
No, not at all. I'll tell you what, I'll just pour myself another drum.
Please. What are you drinking there, Pip? What do you have?
112.45.
Oh, very nice.
My arsenic bottle's run out. This is my standby.
Fresh out of arsenic. See, yeah.
It's a marine decanter. They made them like early whiskey stills.
Ah. So it doesn't tip over.
Right. Paul Levy. Yes. I got this call from this chap called Paul Levy, who told me he wrote for the Wall Street Journal. Now, what Ireland really needed to get the thing moving was some good press in the United States. He was already getting plenty good press of his own account, but something like the Wall Street Journal was the kind of thing you couldn't buy. So Paul Levy rang me up and said he'd heard about the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and he liked what he heard, but frankly, he was suspicious. Basically, he thought it was a lot of bullshit. He thought this was a clever marketing scam, but he thought he might as well sound it out and see what it was like. So I reassured him. I said, clever or not, I'm not really qualified to comment on, but it's not a scam. It's the genuine article, but come and see. If you don't, come and see what we do. And none of it's private. And pay us a visit. I said, if you like, I'll take you around some distilleries. You can talk to them and ask them about us. Needless to say, I'd take them around friendly distilleries, but he said, okay. So it was arranged that he would come and visit us. He would come and we'd visit the vaults, and then I would take him to one or two distilleries. So on the appointed day, Paul pitched up with a photographer in tow at Waverley Station in Edinburgh, and I met them, took them to the vault. And I showed them what we were doing. Everything was above board, and he approved of what we were doing. He couldn't but approve of the whiskey because we were getting some lovely whiskey at the time. And we agreed that the following morning that I would drive them north and we would visit one or two distilleries. And that was fine. And they would take some photographs and they would do a piece about it. And I had the question then arose was, where do you take the food and wine writer of the Wall Street Journal for dinner in Edinburgh? There were lots of smart restaurants in Edinburgh at the time, but I thought I can do better than this. And I bethought me of a restaurant called Cushie's. Now, Cushie's was an Indian restaurant. It is an Indian restaurant. It's still there. It was set up in 1947, adjacent to Edinburgh Medical School, to cater for students from the Indian subcontinent who wanted something recognizable as the sort of food they ate at home. And it was Mr. and Mrs. Cushy who set it up. I first discovered it in 1957 because among my checkered past was a couple of years as a medical student, which came to an end as a result of falling down a mountain, but that's another story. Cushy's had moved the restaurant by that time to Drummond Street, where it still is today, but they hadn't changed the decor or the food in the slightest. All the food was cooked by Mrs. Cushy in great big cauldrons, and you ate at tables which were wiped in between servings, but you ordered at the counter and somebody brought your grub. It was the most basic of restaurant experiences, the sort of thing that Paul Levy had probably never experienced in his life. He probably never went to restaurants like that. But what it did have was the most wonderful Punjabi cooking. Mm. And I took Paul Levy to Cushy's, and he liked it. And he had admitted to me afterwards that he was a bit sniffy about it, but that he liked it a lot. So the next morning, they were staying in a hotel, and I picked them up at their hotel in the Lagonda. Now, the Lagonda was a 4-seater, and I had to explain, it was April, I remember, and I had to explain that the heater didn't really work, but that he and the photographer would sit in the back seat. The back seat was leather and luxurious. The leather was scruffy, but at least it felt luxurious. But what I had was a traveling rug, and this traveling rug was the skin of a black bear. And I settled there. I mean, it was big. It must have been about 6 foot square. And I settled, and the black bear skin was sewn onto a blue felt. So it was all quite civilized. Yes. So we put all our gear in the back of the Lagonda, and I settled them in the back seat, and they had the bearskin tucked round them. And we set off north, and it was good weather for April, I was pleased to see. And somewhere north of Abbeymoor, I drew to a halt in something of a hurry. And they were a bit alarmed. Paul said, "What's up?" And I said, "It's all right, just wait a minute." And I got out of the car, and I trotted back down the road. And I came back with a hare, hare like large cousin of rabbit.
The rabbit, yeah.
The hare had been killed by the car before us, and I held it up by the ears, as one does with a hare. And I said, "Look at that." It was still warm. It had been killed by a car before us. And he said, "What are you going to do with that?" And I said, I don't know, but I mean, it's a perfectly good hare. You don't waste things like that. Right. So I chucked it in with the rest of the luggage. Well, we went up to Speyside, and we went, I think, to Tomatin, which wasn't very exciting, I must admit. But then we set off down the A96 to visit Glenfarclas. And on the A96, on that passage, is very twisty. And on one of the twisty sections, I drew to a halt after it and said, "Just a minute." Paul said, "More roadkill?" I said, "We'll see," and trotted back down the road and came back with a brace of pheasants, a cock and a hen, again, recently killed. And I put them in the back of the car, and I said, "I'll tell you what, when we get back to Edinburgh, you'll come to my house and I will cook you a roadkill stew.
Roadkill
And
stew.
we will eat the pheasants and the hare, and I guarantee you good grub. So we went to Glenfarclas, and Glenfarclas were most affable and confirmed that the story I told Paul that I just told you was in fact true. And Glenfarclas were always, they could never quite make up their mind about us as to whether we were a good thing or a bad thing. We kind of interfered with their brand marketing, but on the other hand, we did get them an awful lot of publicity. Anyway, we drove back from Glenfarclas that next day, and I lodged them in their hotel and arranged, and it was late afternoon when I lodged them and went back to the house in Scotland Street. And I stopped off at Sandy Crombie's, who's a very good butcher on Broughton Street. And from Sandy, I bought a large quantity of pork belly. And out of the pork belly and the hare and the pheasants and a couple of bottles of good red wine and some herbs, I made a roadkill stew. I made parsley dumplings, I remember, to go in the roadkill stew. And I went and collected Paul and the photographer, and they thought the place was a bit eccentric, I think, which wasn't surprising. And I served them roadkill stew. And Paul said to me afterwards, he said, I persisted in thinking it was a load of bullshit until the roadkill stew. He said it was the roadkill stew that convinced me that it must be the real thing. And the result was, as you know, the best part of a page in the Wall Street Journal, than which you could not ask for better. And Alan was a very happy man.
You can't pay for that sort of advertising. You just can't. That's a really, I mean, that's just one of several stories in the book that is truly remarkable. And anyone who hasn't listened to Pip before today, certainly I encourage you to pick up his books, not just The Founder's Tale, but his previous releases, as well as on the Society podcast, Whisky Talk. The first two episodes are dedicated to a very special event that Pip did last year in 2019, right, Pip? Is that correct? Yeah, at the vaults, where they filled the main room of the vaults with about 100, 150 members or so, and popped open cask 1.1. Obviously, the very first cask they ever released from the society. So a master storyteller for sure.
I was very pleased with the society about that, because I have never approved of people who buy liquor and then keep it because it might be valuable someday. I think that's quite the wrong thing to do with good liquor. And I was delighted with the management at the society that, having found a bottle of 1.1, they did the best possible thing with it and opened it.
Absolutely. And that's very much the ethos that we try to transmit to the members. And certainly I think anyone who's drawn to the society already has that sense of not just discovery, but sharing these discoveries with others. And, I think that's certainly evidenced in the members who have come together with us in the past in person. And now, in light of these circumstances of 2020 that have been exceptional, to say the least, sort of opening this up to a larger audience beyond the few cities that we've consistently done events in. So I think that message of cracking open that bottle and pouring a dram, for you and your buddies is certainly still very, very much there, alive and well, if you will. But I have another question for you, if you don't mind. In our chat before we went live, I had asked you, Pip, if there were any wild stories that maybe didn't make it through the publisher's filter that you wanted to share with us now. You had countered with a really nice story about a gentleman named Max McLeod, Would you would you say a few words about Max for us?
Well, Max is an old and very dear friend of mine, and I wrote a lovely chapter about Max. No, it's not a wild story in the slightest. Far from it. It's a very gentle story in which not an awful lot happens. But it's such a dear story, and he's such a dear guy. And I had when I was doing the book, I was sending chapters off to the publisher as they were written, and I wrote this one about Max, and it was about something that had happened only a few months before, and I said to Max, I really ought to show you this to make sure you don't mind, because it was a very intimate portrait of Max in some ways, and I sent Max a copy, and he was horrified, and he said, "Oh, I'd much rather you didn't publish this," which was such a shame, and because in a sense, the whole story was really a portrait of Max, because he is such an unusual person and such a delight. I can tell you very roughly what happened, but that's about all. Max told me that he had to bring a boat back from a place called Ned in Wester Ross. Now, Wester Ross is a place which is inconceivably remote to people who live on the North American continent, not because it's distant, because nowhere in Scotland is all that distant from anywhere else, but because nobody ever goes there. And I have a Land Rover. Days of driving drafty Lagondas are over, I'm pleased to say. I now drive a Land Rover Discovery, which is wonderful, which Maggie gave me as a birthday present. And Max, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a minefield. I don't want to divulge to you anything that would cause Max unhappiness. But Max is a very curious character, in that he's a man in his 60s, and he lives a most unorthodox lifestyle. He is a journalist, and a good one, but he does odd things. And he rang me up one day and he said, "Pip, you want to come to India?" And I was feeling a bit grumpy, and I said, "No, I don't want to go to India." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I've got asthma. I couldn't breathe the air. Anyway, I've got various things wrong with me, and India would not be a good place to be." "Oh," he said. I said, "Anyway, why do you want to go to India?" He said, "Well, I'm actually just going to India on the way to Tibet, where I'm going to talk to the Dalai Lama." And I very grumpily replied, I said, "I don't approve of the Dalai Lama. He's a Buddhist of some sort, like all these Tibetans. I don't really approve of Buddhism. Oh, I approve of some Buddhism, but not a lot." And he said, "Well, too bad." And he said, "By the way, you said you would help me bring my boat down from Ned." And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'd bring you a boat down." He said, "When would you like to do it?" So we arranged that I would bring this boat down. The reason I was bringing the boat was that I had a Land Rover, and Max had a car which, like all Max's cars, was not to be relied on to bring a boat. So Max and I went off in my Land Rover and went to this place called Ned, and you wouldn't believe this place. We got to Ullapool. Now, Ullapool is the back of beyond. I mean, if you would think of the most remote conceivable place in Nova Scotia, then you'd probably be getting on for Ullapool. And there was the one thing there was a fish and chip shop in Ullapool, and we went into the fish and chip shop, and the woman behind the counter said, "Hello, Max," and Max said, "Hello, two fish suppers." And we came out, and I said to him, I said, "Who was that, Max?" Because the woman obviously knew Max extremely well. And he said, "No idea, I've never seen her in my life." And this was just the beginning. We went, the road from Ullapool was a single track road. That's to say, a carriageway wide enough to take one vehicle and one vehicle only, which every few hundred yards would have a passing place. If you've driven in Scotland, you know what they're like. And we drove north on this, and we found the boat, and we hitched it up, and the wheel fell off the trailer, and a whole lot of terrible things happened. And we drove all night in terrible weather. And we ended not far from our house, and in Montrose. And at 4 a.m, one of the wheels came off the trailer with this large boat on it. And I found myself at 4 a.m, lying on my back in freezing cold. The road had ice on it, trying to get a jack under this trailer. And saying to Max, "Max, I am at present, as you know, I am lying under this trailer. And as you possibly don't know, I am 78 years old, and I shouldn't be doing this." "No," he said, "would you like a dram?" I said, "What a good idea." So I extricated myself from under the trailer, and we happened to have a bottle of Society whiskey with us, an essential travelling equipment. Yes. And we poured ourselves a very large dram, which we drank straight because we didn't have any water. And I won't go into the end of the story because it's a long story. One of these days, I'll get Max's permission to publish it.
Very good.
That wasn't much of a story.
It was still pretty fun, though. I mean, I have to say that, no matter where these stories go, it's fun to listen to you recall them for sure. I had one question that popped out in the chat here. Do you have a favorite flavor profile from the Scotch Malt Whisky Society?
No, I don't.
Okay, you don't discriminate.
Flavor profiles. The term flavor profile is a term which I coined to describe a system of exhibiting flavor, which I'm trying to persuade Richard at the moment that he should think about for our society. But we'll let that flea stick to the wall, as they say. There is one whiskey which I think has a most distinctive flavor in that it tastes of honey. I know some whiskeys taste of honey, but Glenrothes, do you remember Glenrothes?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. Up on Speyside.
Yeah.
Not the industrial town in Fife, but Glenrothes makes a perfectly lovely whiskey which tastes of honey. And my introduction to Glenrothes was curious in that I was in London one day, and I was in a very posh part of London called St. James's. I was there with a journalist, and the journalist there is a wine merchant in St James's called Berry Brothers and Rudd. And that wine merchant has been there in the same shop for the last 300 years. So it's the real article. And she said, oh, look, there's Berry Brothers. Let's go and talk to them. She was a very personable journalist, I have to say. And she sashayed in and said, hiya, guys. And this is a wine merchant which is so posh that all its assistants wear three-piece suits and ties. Maybe they don't wear ties nowadays, but they did in those days. And we explained what we were about, and they were most affable. And at some point, somebody mentioned the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and I told them who I was, whereupon more young gentlemen in suits came out, literally out of the paneling, because in that sort of store, there is oak paneling on the walls, and some bits of it open up into doors. And it turned out that there was a secret coven of Scotch Malt Whisky Society members in this posh wine shop. And they asked me if I would like to try some whiskey. And I said, well, nothing compares. And they poured me a whiskey because Berry Brothers own Glenrothes.
Yeah.
And they poured me a dram of Glenrothes. And they said, how would you describe its flavor? And it was just instantaneous. I've never come across such an instantaneous recognition. I had a sniff of this stuff. And I said, it smells of honey. And it did. And it does. Every time I drink Glenrothes, I think it smells of honey. So next time you drink Glenrothes, try for honey.
We will. We'll try for honey and we'll think of you for sure. That's great. Geez, I had a couple more questions here, but we're coming up, we're about an hour and a half or so. So perhaps we should let everyone who's still watching know that earlier this year, we were really trying desperately to have Pip and his better half, Maggie, come over for a lovely tour across the U.S. And we are still trying for this. We haven't given up on it yet. But I think for now, we will thank you very much for your time, Pip, and hope that we get to share a dram with you in person sometime very, very soon. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Any parting shots for us here in the U.S.?
Simply that it will be a pleasure to see you in the United States. I'm an unofficial ambassador for America, because every time I have been in the United States, I have always met the nicest of people and had a really great time. So I look forward to doing it again, and so does Maggie. I should say that the last time we were in New York, Maggie bought a Gucci coat.
Oh, goodness. Well, we'll have to get her to
And she just said offhand, she said, you bought it for me.
Some shopping on Fifth Avenue is in store for sure. Well, for anyone who wasn't with us at the very beginning, just a quick merciless plug. For those of you who are purchasing from the global gathering outturn tomorrow, any purchase of 3 bottles or more will score you a Founder's Tale by none other than Mr. Pip Hills. A wonderful collection of stories about inception. What's that?
Tell them if they post it to me, I'll autograph it and send it back to them.
Okay, very good. That's an open invitation for a signed copy by Pip, which again, we were supposed to do in person. But we'll get around to that. If you can't wait for that, then do post it to Pip and reach out to me, and we can get you sorted out there. But in the meantime, grab a glass of malt, grab this book, and have a really nice couple of hours. Pip, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we hope to talk to you again very, very soon. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yes.
Lonja.
Bye.
And we'll see you soon, man. Bye-bye.
Cheers.